Snow fell in heavy, soundless sheets over the mining town of Norovsk. At -30, even the air felt brittle enough to shatter. Frost rimmed the steel balcony of the Morozovs' apartment, catching the weak orange of street lamps before dawn. Boots thudded in the corridor, a rhythm too deliberate to mistake for neighbors. Alexei Morozov had 10 seconds to wake his wife before the knock came. 10 seconds to accept that the sound meant the end of everything they still owned. The officials' breath steamed through their scarves as they pushed inside, waving a seal marked State Property Reclamation. They said it without anger, almost politely. The apartment was no longer his. The mining board had decided he was unfit for reinstatement after a structural fault under his supervision caused the shaft collapse. Sabotage, some whispered. And so, by decree, the property reverted to the municipality. No time for questions, none for defense. The bailiff nodded to the soldiers. Cabinets opened. Drawers spilled documents and blueprints across the frozen floor. His wife, Lena, clutched their son Pavel's arm tighter, her breath catching when the youngest guard avoided her gaze. It wasn't cruelty, just embarrassment for the living. Outside, wind howled through the skeletal cranes lining the valley. Trucks moved between slag heaps with headlamps lowered, muted by the fog. The Morozovs stepped into the street with one suitcase and a small bundle of linens. The apartment door slammed shut behind them, sealed with red wax. Alexei turned once. "They will never let me prove it," he murmured. He meant the fracture in the shaft wall, not his guilt, but his miscalculation. He had reported flaws before the collapse, but the inspection committee, chasing quotas, had buried his letters. Now they buried him. They walked until the town's glow vanished behind frost-smoked air. Pavel's schoolbook stiffened in his hands. Lena's boots, once government issue, had cracks stitched with wire. Every crunch underfoot sounded final. By noon, they reached the edge of what had been the district's industrial belt. 3 kilometers of rusted hangars, storage platforms, and conveyors frozen mid-motion since the mine shut down. It smelled of iron and oil, the ghosts of production days. Alexei stopped at a fence twisted open by time. "No one comes here," he said. His voice had the calm of a calculation. Not reassurance, only fact. "We can rest inside." Lena hesitated. "In there? It's condemned. So are we." Grey sky pooled through broken roof panels as they stepped inside the factory yard. Icicles hung like daggers from gantries. Snow covered the tracks of old rail carts leading to a loading bay. Alexei's fingers traced a line of rivets along a corroded wall, counting in his head, measuring distance. He found a maintenance hatch, half buried near a collapsed air intake tower. The padlock had long since rusted off. When he pried it open, stale air climbed up, a mixture of oil residue and cold dirt. Beneath, narrow stairs descended into blackness. "Basement tunnels," he murmured. "They linked pumping rooms. If the structure's intact." He didn't finish. Pavel peered into the dark. "Can we live there?" Alexei looked at his son's cracked lips, the bluish skin at his fingertips. The question was both innocent and fatal. "Temporarily," he said, though he already counted how many cubic meters of soil pressed above those walls, how condensation might collect from thermal difference. They descended with one flashlight, the cone of light trembling with each step. The walls were brick, sweating ice. At the bottom stretched a corridor with pipes running like veins across the ceiling, ending in a series of side rooms. He kicked a stone. It clanged away into darkness, echoing back differently each time. The sound told him more than sight could. Solid structure, not hollow caverns. Survivable. He set the suitcase down. "We'll clean this first chamber. Make it dry." Lena brushed frost from a broken pipe. "You think like an engineer even now. I don't know how to stop." They found an old emergency power unit in a corner, its casing split, but copper coils intact. Alexei ran his glove across it, as if greeting an old friend. With a few hand tools scavenged upstairs, maybe it could recharge the lantern batteries. As evening clawed back over the valley, they lit a small can of alcohol fuel, the last from his lab kit. The pale flame cast copper reflections across damp walls. Above them, the sirens wailed. The curfew, the same one that began each night since the sabotage inquiry. It meant the inspection patrols soon would roam the streets, checking papers. Lena asked, "Where will we go after tomorrow?" Alexei looked upward, as though seeing the frozen world through 12 meters of concrete. "Not up, not yet. We hide down here. I can seal those stairs before morning." Pavel whispered, "So they won't find us?" Alexei met his eyes. "They won't even know we're still alive." The wind rose again outside, filling ruined corridors with a low moan that could have been the breath of the whole abandoned plant. For the first time since dawn, Alexei forced himself to smile, not because he believed in safety, but because he understood design. Walls could fail, people could lie, but numbers, pressure, load, flow, remained honest. He picked up the wrench. The sound of metal against metal echoed like a heartbeat beginning again underground. By dawn, the storm had buried their tracks. The town's smokestacks rose faintly through morning haze, but no light glowed in that direction, only the faint hum of distant generators. Inside the factory, frost crept across every surface like spreading lace. Alexei sat beside a dented lantern, clicking through his sketches in the half-dark. On scraps of torn packaging, he drew pressure diagrams, temperature notes, angles of airflow. His pencil snapped twice in the cold, before Lena stirred beside him. "You haven't slept," she said quietly. "Neither has the wind," he replied. "It's better this way. I can hear where the air leaks through." He pointed toward the passage leading deeper into the basement. Overnight, he'd noticed cold vapor rising from a low grate, the sign of a secondary chamber below. "There's room under us, perhaps another level. If that space holds dry, we could build storage." Lena shivered under their thin blanket. "For what? We have nothing left." "Yes," Alexei murmured, "but nothing can still be arranged." He spent the first morning scavenging. The upper shop floors were dangerous, metal catwalks bent like skeins of ribbon. Yet, among broken machines, he found treasures: a spool of copper wire, a hammer, cracked insulation panels, pieces of reinforced mesh. Pavel followed silently, his small hands clutching a tin can that clinked with bolts. Every sound they made seemed to echo too long. The factory had once processed ore, the kind that left grey dust on everything. It coated their boot prints, giving them the appearance of ghosts. By noon, Alexei had hauled all they could carry back to the basement. He started with the walls. Using old mesh and pieces of I-beams, he reinforced the first chamber's structure, anchoring them with quick-setting compound mixed from cement dust and melted snow. "Thermal mass," he explained to Lena when she watched wordlessly. "The ground's heat may be our only ally. These walls must hold and store it." Her expression twitched between awe and despair. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't, but simplicity is survival." To seal gaps, he packed rags soaked in pitch, scraped from old cable drums. With his knife, he scraped away rust flakes until the metal bled clean red again. The smell of tar filled the passage, sticky and nauseating, but it meant safety. When sundown came, he tested what they had built. He pressed a candle close to each seam. The flame wavered only faintly. "Good," he whispered. "Air exchange minimal. We'll handle proper ventilation later." They ate rationed bread and water, old field biscuits Alexei had stolen from an inspection locker before the eviction. Pavel asked if they would live here forever. Alexei's hand paused mid-motion. "Only until the city forgets us." Days blurred into an unmeasured rhythm. Alexei's routine shaped like clockwork. Mornings collecting scrap, afternoons reinforcing supports, nights sketching around the dim light. Lena cleaned a dry chamber deeper in the corridor, turning it into a sleeping area lined with insulation. She hummed softly, not songs, only wordless reminders of a time when voices dared echo. Pavel drew on the walls with bits of charcoal, rendering crooked houses and one tall chimney. "So inspectors can find their way out," he joked with a child's grim wit. His laughter startled them. It felt almost treasonous in that silence. Midweek, Alexei found the ventilation core, a vertical shaft once used to cool generator rooms. When he shined his flashlight upward, frost glittered along steel ribs that disappeared 50 meters above. He timed the wind pulses with his watch. Every 2 minutes, a faint draft. "Still breathing," he murmured. If he could seal a side channel, slow the airflow, he could build a heat gradient to make warmer air rise naturally. He explained the principle aloud, half for Lena, half for himself. Warm air expands, less dense, pushes upward. Cold air drawn from other tunnels replaces it. Regulate the speed, and air renews itself. A poor man's lung. That evening, he scavenged lengths of conduit, fashioning makeshift valves by bending sheet metal and fixing it with wire hinges. He installed them in sequence so he could control airflow manually. When he pulled the lever, the valves clanked, coughing a cloud of dust, but the passage lived again. From above, wind howled through the ruined factory roofs and mixed with this newborn echo. For the first time, the underground space didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a machine slowly waking. Lena tested the warmth near the lantern. "It's holding better," she whispered, touching the wall. Frost had receded an inch. Alexei smiled slightly. "That's mathematics you can feel." But his satisfaction didn't last. That night, heavy footsteps sounded across the upper floorboards, multiple pairs, synchronized. He froze mid-task. Lena snuffed the lamp, plunging them into perfect black. Voices filtered through the ventilation, distorted, official. Someone mentioned the engineer's name. Another cursed the leak of confidential files. Pavel gripped his mother's sleeve. Alexei counted the spacing of each step. By the reverberation, he judged they were in the main hall, 30 meters above. For a long minute, silence. Then a crash of metal, a shouted order, boots retreating. Only when their echoes faded did Lena whisper, "They still hunt you." "Not me," Alexei said quietly. "They hunt the story. It's easier to erase a man than admit a mind failed from greed." He stared at his trembling hands, oil smudged deep into the creases. Engineering once meant precision. Now it was camouflage. When the last sound above vanished, he set his wrench down and listened. The factory settled with soft creaks, metal adjusting to temperature. It reminded him of a living organism, bones shifting in sleep. "We'll survive," he whispered, more to the machinery than to his family. "They took timetables and documents, but they can't take angles and pressure. As long as we keep the system balanced, they'll never know what breathes beneath their feet." He closed the valve gently. Airflow slowed to a soft sigh, almost like snow falling unseen. By the second week, the tunnels no longer smelled of rust. They smelled of damp canvas, burnt oil, and bread crusts toasted over a borrowed flame. The space, once meant for pumps and wiring, had become a home, not by comfort, but by deliberate design. Alexei rose each morning before the others. He logged every change in the environment, the condensation rings creeping lower on the brick, the rhythm of drip water from the pipes, the air's faint shift from metallic to earthen. These signs told him when pressure built behind frozen soil outside and when he needed to adjust airflow to avoid collapse. The engineer in him couldn't rest. Whatever guilt or exile he carried above ground, transformed here into mathematics and labor. He used fractured tiles to form a crude platform for sleeping. He reinforced walls with planks scavenged from the upper storage hall, driving screws with the heel of a wrench. From bundles of wire, he twisted fasteners, lashing them in an X across damaged beams. Every structure, he muttered. Needs a pattern. Lena, wrapped in her scarf, watched him from the doorway. You look like a man still building bridges no one will cross. He paused, the hammer poised mid-air. People don't cross bridges because they fear the drop, not the engineer. The words came out sharper than he meant. He returned to his work and adjusted the brace's angle until friction squeaked correctly. Not too tight, not loose. Harmony through metal. That afternoon, the wind outside changed tone. It hummed, a divergent note that shivered through the pipes like a warning. Pavel pointed upward. It sounds like singing. It's pressure, Alexei corrected gently. A storm building west. When it reaches here, we'll test our seals. Another test? Lena sighed. You already run this place like a factory. That's what keeps us unseen, he said. Factories have logic. People have fear. He took inventory later at the small table they assembled from crates. Their supplies could last 10 days if rationed tightly. Flour, tins of fish, dried peas. Water was constant but tricky. The factory's old drainage line carried snowmelt. Alexei had fit a makeshift sand charcoal filter into a cracked pipe coupling, proving it safe enough if boiled. On the 10th morning, frost returned thicker than before. The ventilation shaft dripped condensation that froze into fine prisms on the floor. Yet the temperature near their sleeping corner held steady, -4 instead of -10. His geometry of heat retention worked. Still, sound carried too easily. More than once they heard dogs above, the municipal patrols sweeping abandoned blocks. To muffle noise, Alexei hung wool blankets soaked in salt water along the corridor ends. When they dried rigid, they trapped echo like insulation panels. Pavel began collecting small relics from the upper levels. Machine tags, bolts, parts of gauges. For toys, he explained. Alexei let him, though every trip upstairs gnawed at his nerves. One evening, the boy returned with something heavier, an old identification plate reading, "Property of Norovsk Metallurgic Combine." Lena touched it with trembling fingers. They built the mine from this very plant. Do you realize that? Alexei nodded. And now the mine took everything from us. A perfect cycle. She stared at him, half in hurt, half in admiration. You speak as if the machines sinned, not men. He looked at the plate again. Machines never sign false reports. Outside, the storm finally came. It arrived with a roar like trains colliding, wind battering the torn roofs above. Snow poured through the holes, hissing against metal. Within hours, the world above would vanish under white. Perfect. No one would suspect human life under that stillness. But survival asked more than concealment. It demanded progress. Alexei spent the blizzard fashioning a secondary exit. He chose a drainage vent near the tunnel's far end, clearing it with the blunt end of a pipe wrench. Beyond lay a crawl space that curved upward into a slanted duct, maybe 30 meters of tight climb before reaching the outside perimeter. It's our escape, he explained to Lena as he fastened iron bolts to the rim. If they ever sweep again, or this layer floods, we go through here, one at a time. She held the lantern close, illuminating his breath. And what if they catch us outside? He hesitated. Then they catch an empty hole, nothing more, because I'll seal the door behind you. Her hand gripped his sleeve. You wouldn't. He met her eyes steadily. I would. That's why I have to make sure it never comes to that. They worked without rest through the night. Each strike of his hammer became a heartbeat, a promise carved into metal. When the final bolt locked, the echo thundered down the corridor, proof of endurance louder than despair. At dawn, silence returned. Snowfall above had sealed the main hatch completely, muffling every sound. Only the ventilation shaft breathed faintly, steady as sleep. Pavel drew patterns on the soot-stained wall, rectangles within rectangles, layers of shelter. Like a puzzle, he said proudly. Yes, Alexei answered. watching the faint glow in the boy's eyes. "And every puzzle has one missing piece. We'll build it before spring." Lena smiled faintly. "You think that far?" He nodded once. "Because I intend for him to see it." That day, beneath meters of snow, Alexei unlocked a final door within himself, the engineer reborn from the outcast. Each bolt he tightened ceased being defense and became defiance, each calculation a quiet oath that if the authorities erased his name, they would never erase his design. Above ground, the inspectors marked his file terminated. Below, the hum of pipes answered back like a heart refusing silence. When the blizzard eased, a faint light reached through the fractured skylight above the main hall, skating across icicles like sparks sliding off a blade. The thaw had come early that year, though no one dared call it spring. In the basement, Alexei wiped steam from his goggles as he powered the generator for the first time. The salvaged unit sputtered, coughed, then steadied into a nervous hum. Pale electric light flickered through the tunnel, startling Pavel, who clapped his hands. "Electricity," the boy whispered, as if naming a miracle might scare it away. Alexei allowed himself a breath of pride. He had rewired half the basement to feed from this unit. Salvaged windings, a crankshaft scavenged from the old freight elevator, and gasoline filtered from frozen barrels above. When the rotor turned properly, the light bulb shone warm enough to chase the frost off a wall. He called it the heart. Lena touched the trembling glow and smiled. "It feels alive." "It is," he said. "Heat and breath, our own small hearth in the veins of metal." They were quiet a long time, listening to the rhythm of the machine and the distant groans of ice falling from the higher floors. Slowly, color began to return to their cheeks. Warmth replaced charcoal in their lungs. By day, Alexei adjusted his invention. He built a series of pulley-driven panels along the wall to redirect warm air toward different chambers, experimenting until he found the perfect angle. "Convection currents need direction," he told Lena. "Control the path, control the loss." She smiled faintly. "You talk the way priests talk about souls." "Engineering is the same faith," he replied, "except we test ours." For the first time, Pavel played without trembling. He rolled his metal toys across the stable floor and arranged bolts into rows of imaginary soldiers. Yet each sound, a laugh, a clang, sent a shiver through Alexei. Above them lay silence too thick, too deliberate. At dusk, he ventured to the surface again. Crawling through the drainage vent took 10 minutes of scraping elbows and holding his breath. Snow blinded him when he emerged. Only the top ridges of the factory roofs protruded like islands in an endless sea of white. From a distance came the crackle of soldiers' radios. The town was still under watch. No one had cleared the streets yet. In their temporary absence, wild dogs prowled the edges of the industrial zone, ghosts of the living. Alexei crouched low and scanned the horizon. The main road shimmered with melting snow, but against the glare he spotted shapes, figures hauling crates into a truck parked near the mine's administration office. Curiosity twisted into anger when he recognized them as the same officials who had signed the eviction order. They laughed as they loaded boxes marked "Equipment Seized from Unit 7, his old department. He almost stood up before reason reined him in. Emotion was a luxury he could no longer afford. Night descended by the time he returned. He sealed the vent behind him, pressing his ear to the metal. The blizzard had given way to meltwater that dripped through cracks like a ticking clock. Every drop meant pressure building, the soil above saturated, heavy. He fetched his measuring rod and calculated stress distribution along the load-bearing beams. At the junction between old concrete and the newer patchwork wall, he found the first fracture. The line was narrow but deep, just enough to whisper when wind passed. He reinforced it with mesh and wood braces, muttering calculations under his breath. If the melt freezes again, shear force doubles. We'll need extra footing. Lena watched, worried. You think everything can be solved with bolts? It can, he said. Then after a moment softer, if you start soon enough. 3 nights later, noise returned above. Not the hum of patrols this time, something heavier. A bulldozer groaned nearby, the earth trembling through their walls. They're clearing the snow, Lena guessed. Alexei's face drained color. Or demolishing unsafe sites. They snuffed the lights at once. Through an overhead pipe, faint vibrations pulsed, the rhythm of heavy machinery rolling over frozen ground. Every pass made dust fall from the ceiling. They can't level this, she whispered. It's too far out. He shook his head. They only need an excuse. The vibration passed eventually, replaced by distant beeps and fading engines. Still, they remained motionless for hours afterward. When silence finally returned, Alexei lit a lamp again and inspected the ceiling. Dust snowed down in tiny drifts. No collapse yet. That was only the surface layer, he said, still stable. But he knew stability could betray. He resolved to dig a side cavity, a buffer zone to absorb pressure should the main roof fail. By dawn, he was already chiseling at the north wall, instructing Pavel to collect each chunk and pile it neatly. Before long, the boy's small hands were bleeding through his gloves. Enough, Lena ordered, pulling the child back. He can't work like you. Alexei drew a breath, guilt stinging in his throat. Every hand keeps us breathing, Lena. But I'll finish alone. She turned away, eyes glistening. You're turning this place into a machine that runs on lives. He looked at her long, silently, the sound of his tool echoing. That's all a shelter ever is. By the 5th evening, his tunnel extended 3 meters deep, lined with planks, filled with air warmer than the rest. When he stepped back, sweat freezing on his brow, pride mingled with exhaustion. This, he thought, could carry them through spring. Yet even underground, news traveled. He overheard chatter through the vent again, voices talking about missing families, falsified ledgers, undesirable names, his own printed on a list, headed confirmed missing, presumed dead. He sat motionless for a long time, head bent. In the faint electric hum, it dawned on him. They no longer searched. They had succeeded. On paper, the Morozovs already didn't exist. A strange calm settled over him. Hope, in a way, hurts less when you vanish from its reach. He switched off the generator, letting darkness reclaim the tunnels. In the faint heartbeat of dripping water, he whispered to the sleeping walls, "So be it." They killed a name, not a man. And for the first time, the silence felt like belonging. The first time Alexei left the shelter after learning their names were dead, he moved like a man walking through someone else's life. The factory yard no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed guarded by the simple fact that no one cared about it. Neglect was its own kind of camouflage. He emerged through the drainage vent at 2:14 a.m., timing it to the patrol rotations he'd counted over weeks. Night in Norovsk had a peculiar brightness, snow reflecting moonlight, turning the world into a pale negative photograph. Every shadow looked like a person, until it didn't. He had 7 minutes to cross the open yard before the next sweep. The wind carried the smell of coal smoke and wet timber. Somewhere, a radio played faintly through a cracked window, an old folk melody, warped by distance. Alexei kept low, hugging the collapsed conveyor line like a trench. His goal was not the town center. That was suicide. He aimed for the dumping grounds behind the canteen block, where workers threw spoiled food and broken packaging. Corruption created waste. Waste could keep a family alive. He reached the bins and pried open a frozen lid. Inside lay wilted cabbage, half-rotten potatoes, a torn sack of flour clumped with snow. He worked fast, selecting only what could be salvaged, shaking ice free, wrapping it in cloth. The flour, if dried near their generator warmth, could still be baked into flatbread. A dog barked. Alexei froze, breath held until his lungs burned. The barking shifted, closer, then farther, as if the animal had chosen an easier prey. He resumed, fingers numbing as he tied the bundle. On his way back, he spotted movement near the main road, 2 men smoking beside a parked truck. Their silhouettes were familiar. Mind security, the kind who enjoyed their power because it was the only thing they owned. Alexei slid behind a stack of frozen pallets and listened. Another list came in, one said. More names crossed out, like they never lived here. The other chuckled. Good, less paperwork. Alexei felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. Crossed out, like a measurement erased from a blueprint. He returned underground before dawn, sealing the vent and counting his heartbeats until they slowed. Lena took the bundle, her hands trembling as she opened it. This is what we've become, she whispered. Scavengers. We've always been scavengers, Alexei said. We just used to call it engineering. Pavel's eyes lit at the sight of flour. Can we make pancakes? Lena almost laughed, then turned her face away. Not pancakes, flatbread, like your grandmother used to. That small normality, the idea of bread shaped by hands rather than fear, steadied them for a day. Alexei built a drying rack from wire and positioned it above the generator casing where warmth rose. He scraped mold from potatoes, sliced away rot, boiled what remained with salt, chipped from old storage barrels. The shelter felt briefly like a kitchen, not a bunker, but pressure returned from above in another form. Sound. Rumors seeped down the vent like cold air. One afternoon, while adjusting the valves, Alexei heard 2 voices arguing in the factory yard. They weren't officials, workers, judging by their slang and the tired anger in their tone. They say Morozov blew the strut on purpose, one spat, so they could blame someone and keep the mine open. Morozov? He's gone, the other replied. Deported or dead, doesn't matter. The board already wrote it. Alexei's fingers tightened on the valve lever. Doesn't matter. That night, Lena confronted him in the sleeping chamber. The lantern cast a narrow halo around her face, highlighting the sharpness hunger had carved into her cheeks. We can't live as ghosts forever, she said. Pavel needs daylight, a school, people. People took his school, Alexei answered, and his bed, and your wedding dishes. Her eyes flashed. Then we take them back. He stared at her, exhausted. From whom? The board? The militia? The paper that says we're dead? She stepped closer. From fear. You built this place to keep us alive. But if we stay too long, we'll forget how to live. Alexei had no answer. He turned away and pretended to inspect a wall seam. In truth, her words struck deeper than any official decree. Over the next days, the town above woke with thaw. Meltwater ran in dirty streams along streets, revealing buried trash and the black bones of last year's coal piles. The factory roof groaned as ice slid off in sheets. The basement's humidity rose, and Alexei was forced to increase airflow, more fresh air, but also more risk of sound and scent escaping. He compensated by extending the vent's outlet farther into a pile of scrap metal outside, disguising the warm breath as normal thermal drift from sun-heated steel. He calculated the plume angle using a simple test. He burned a twisted rag soaked in oil at the vent exit and watched how the smoke bent with the wind. When it dispersed along the scrap heap instead of rising in a straight column, he knew it would blend. Like hiding a fire in daylight, he explained to Lena. You don't stop the smoke, you teach it to disappear. One evening, Pavel developed a cough, not severe but persistent, dry, rattling in the small space. Alexei checked his temperature by touch, then by the old mercury thermometer they'd salvaged. 37.9 degrees Celsius, 37.9 degrees Celsius. Mild fever. Lena's composure cracked. It's the air, she whispered. It's doing this. Alexei tightened the vent valve another fraction, then another, until the air exchange increased. The generator's warmth fought the incoming cold. The system balanced on a knife edge. Too much air, and they froze. Too little, and Pavel's lungs would. He spent half the night constructing a second filter box, packed with charcoal from burnt wood, and a layer of cloth soaked in vinegar. It wasn't medicine, but it would reduce dust and mold spores. He mounted it near Pavel's sleeping nook and listened until the boy's breathing eased into a softer rhythm. At dawn, Alexei climbed out again, this time for something riskier than food. He needed real medicine. He moved along alleys, avoiding the square, keeping to walls where meltwater ran deep enough to hide footprints. The pharmacy's back door was locked, but the delivery window had warped from years of ice. He slipped a wire hook through the gap and lifted the latch with trembling hands. Inside, shelves stood half empty. He grabbed what he recognized: aspirin, antiseptic, a small bottle of cough syrup with an outdated label. As he turned to leave, a floorboard creaked. A voice snapped behind him. "Who's there?" Alexei froze. A man stood in the dim stockroom doorway, older, hunched, wearing the grey smock of a pharmacist. His eyes widened, not with aggression, but with startled recognition. "Morozov," the man breathed. "You—" Alexei raised a hand, silent plea. "No names," he whispered. The pharmacist's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then he glanced toward the front door, as if hearing the town itself listening. "They said you were gone," he murmured. "They printed it," Alexei replied. "So it must be true." The man swallowed hard, then stepped aside, letting Alexei pass. "Take what you need," he said quietly, "and don't come back. Not because I won't help, because next time someone will follow you." Alexei hesitated. Gratitude threatened to become a weight. He only nodded once and disappeared into the wet, thawing dawn. Back underground, Lena held the medicine like treasure. Pavel's fever dropped by afternoon. Yet the encounter left Alexei shaken. If one man recognized him, others could too. And somewhere above, the town that had erased them still moved, still watched, still waited for the ground to stop hiding secrets. By mid-March, the factory groaned under meltwater pressure like a ship straining in ice. Pipes cracked with sharp metallic reports, echoing along the tunnels in unpredictable rhythms. For Lena and Pavel, these were merely sounds. For Alexei, they were warnings, stress notes in the structure's anatomy. He began his days crawling through side passages with a lamp tied to his wrist, taking readings with makeshift gauges of his own design, nails driven into seams, strings stretched between them to measure displacement. If a string sagged by more than a millimeter overnight, that meant motion. "Like measuring heartbeat," he murmured one dawn, recording results on a scrap of cardboard. Above ground, Norovsk thawed unevenly. The snow curtain withdrew to reveal collapsed shacks, puddled sludge, and tracks where trucks had dragged the last usable scrap toward the rail. The air smelled of rust and wet fuel, carried into the factory through vents no matter how he sealed them. Inside, tension among them thickened. Lena had grown restless, often staring at the ceiling as if she could see through to the sky. Pavel's cough had eased, but silence made the child uneasy. He began whispering to his metal toys, arranging them in long rows and giving them names. One evening, Lena said, "He talks to ghosts because they answer faster than you." Alexei set down his notebook. "I answer with work. That's the problem." The argument ended before it began. In the factory's half-dark, words carried too far, reverberating off walls like accusations. That night, as he tried to sleep, distant pounding jolted him awake, not from human hands, but shifting concrete somewhere above. He listened, counting intervals between sounds. The pattern was irregular, yet growing faster. The thaw was accelerating. He rose immediately, pulling on his coat. Stay here, he told Lena. If a wall cracks, take Pavel through the southern tunnel. You remember the markings? Yes, but don't wait for me. He grabbed his lantern and hurried toward the main corridor. The floor was slick with new condensation. Droplets clung to wires like a string of glass beads. He found the source near the northwest column, a fissure wide enough for candlelight to bleed through. Warm wind rushed from it, unnatural, too strong, meaning a void had opened somewhere behind the wall. Alexei pressed his hand to the crack and felt tremor. Sub-level collapse, perhaps a void forming under the pump room floor. That old foundation slab had been poured thin. Saturation could make it fail like cardboard. He calculated fast. If collapse reached the load beam, their sheltered chambers could deform. There was one way to redirect stress. Expand support braces immediately, even if the framework distorted. He sprinted back for tools. In the sleeping chamber, Lena stood at the doorway clutching Pavel's arm. What is it? The floor under the west side. Void expansion. I need to relieve pressure. Can't it wait until... Not an hour. He was already dragging a steel bar toward the fracture. For 10 frantic minutes, he worked without thought. Every clang sent echoes rolling like thunder. He wedged wooden props, bolted plates across the main seam, tightened ropes soaked in resin to bind the mesh. When the final bolt seated properly, the creaking subsided. The factory breathed again, slower. Safe for now. Then came silence so absolute it hurt the ears. From that moment, something between gratitude and dread took root in Lena's chest. She understood now that the building itself obeyed him, not through strength, but through relentless reasoning. Yet she also saw what it was costing. That night, when he finally stopped working, she whispered, "You saved us. But when do you stop saving and start living?" He answered without looking up, "When proof outweighs accusation." Days turned gradually warmer. The first drip of outside rain made tiny chants on the steel pipes. Pavel giggled, pointing at the sound. "It's raining, Mama. Above us." "Yes," she said softly, though her eyes glistened. "Above us." Alexei noticed moisture gathering on the ceiling, condensation from the rising humidity. It ran in rivulets down the brick, into crevices he'd carefully sealed months before. His earlier genius now trapped water inside. Sealing meant protection in winter. In spring, it meant suffocation. He cut vents through the upper corridor walls, short relief ducts connected to rusted vertical pipes that still reached open air. "Controlled breathing," he muttered. "Too dry and we freeze. Too wet and walls soften." Each adjustment became a moral decision disguised as math. When he opened the second vent, the outside air smelled unexpectedly sweet. He realized it carried pine resin, forest thaw. The world was waking without them. By late April, the hum of trucks grew fainter. The mining company had shifted its equipment to another valley. Only a handful of guards remained, their movements lazy now that the scandal had cooled. Norovsk was sinking into forgetfulness, and with it, a strange opportunity emerged. Alexei began gathering maps, fragments torn from packaging, scraps imprinted with shipping details. He drafted a route leading north toward the railway buffer zone, a distance of 12 kilometers through wilderness. "If we move at night," he explained to Lena, 3 days to reach forest line, another day to railway. There are work trains still, maybe freight cars. She folded her arms. "You're dreaming again." "Dreaming is designed for souls," he said. "We can't die as proof of their paperwork." But before they could plan departure, smaller troubles began multiplying. Their food stock ran thin. Rats invaded from the drainage system. Alexei crafted traps from cans and counterweights, catching just enough to keep rodents off their supplies. The generator coughed with irregular beats. Its bearings wore out, and each repair risked sparks in confined air. And Pavel's laughter, once a sign of resilience, became strange. He began whispering to corners, telling unseen workers to hurry, mimicking his father's gestures. One night Lena found him miming the tightening of invisible bolts. "Stop that," she said sharply. "It's not a game." He blinked, confused. "But if I don't fix it, the roof will fall." She hugged him fiercely, trembling. The factory was remaking the child in its own image, machine learning to breathe through human lungs. When Alexei saw them curled together asleep later, he realized her warning held truth. Staying meant surviving. Leaving meant remembering life. He stared at the cracked ceiling where water shimmered like mercury in lamplight and whispered to himself, "Structures endure only when released from weight." For the first time, the idea of escape outweighed the urge to perfect the shelter. Yet he didn't know that beyond those thick walls, the rising water from Thor had found the same cracks he once sealed, and was already creeping toward their sanctuary's lowest floor. The dripping had changed. It was no longer rhythmic, no longer the casual breath of meltwater through old pipes. It was constant now, insistent, like a hidden clock counting down. When Alexei first noticed it, he thought it was rain slipping through a damaged vent. But by evening, water pooled along the lower corridor, reflecting lantern light in restless ripples. He dipped his hand into it, ice cold, gritty with silt, not surface runoff, groundwater. The frost line had broken. He followed the trickle deeper into the maintenance crawl space he'd once sealed off for safety. The air there hung thick with humidity, and somewhere beyond the wall came the faint intake of air through water, bubbling, steady, dangerous. Subfloor breach, he realized, pulse spiking. One of the sump chambers was filling. He returned to the main room, already stripping his coat sleeves. "We have to start moving sections up." Lena turned from the stove tin where she'd been heating broth. "Up where?" "The next tier. The old freight corridor. Half collapsed, yes, but higher. Water's coming through the pump lines. We could have 12 hours before it reaches here." She stared blankly. 12 hours? "That's an estimate," he admitted, grabbing his wrench. "Could be 10. They worked without pause. Pavel ferried blankets and food to the upper tunnel, while Lena carried their tools. Each echo sounded heavier, dulled by growing damp. The reflection on the floor climbed steadily, from puddle to shine, then to mirror. By midnight, the first chamber stood ankle deep. The rising water smelled like metal and rot. Their generator hissed when mist touched its casing. "Shut it down," Lena urged. "Not yet. We need light until the end." Alexei rigged a siphon hose from a fuel drum and an old pump cylinder. He primed it, cranked the handle, and watched with grim satisfaction as a stream gushed through a side pipe, redirecting flow toward the drainage vent that exited outside the yard. "That buys us time," he said. But time, like electricity, drained faster than expected. The leak outpaced the pump. Cracks widened under unseen pressure. In the silence between revolutions of the crank, he heard the groan of distant rock layers settling. The factory's old foundations were shifting. By dawn, his breath came ragged from exertion. Lena forced him to sit for a moment. "You can't fight the ground, Alexei." He wiped sweat from his temple. "The ground built these walls. I only borrowed its patience." Pavel crawled toward them, eyes wide. "Papa, the corridor's talking." Alexei rose instantly. A low moan echoed from the north wall, followed by a dull pop, the sound of a seal bursting under pressure. A jet of muddy water hissed from the crack, arcing across the corridor. In seconds, the flow became a torrent. He shoved Lena and Pavel toward the ladder that led to the freight corridor. "Up! Now! Don't stop for anything!" "What about, 'I'll follow'?" He stayed behind only long enough to close the lower hatch and jam a steel beam across as a barricade. Then he climbed after them, water licking at his boots. The next level was drier, but far colder. Crystals of frost hung from ruptured pipes, where sunlight pierced through roof holes in narrow slants. Lena collapsed near a broken workbench, gasping for breath. Pavel clutched her shoulder, trembling. Alexei sat beside them, his own hands shaking. Beneath their feet, the sound of rushing water continued, muted now, but relentless. "It'll fill completely," he said quietly. "Everything down there. The generator, supplies, all of it." Lena looked at him, a strange calm in her face. "Then that place kept its promise. It died keeping us alive." He wanted to answer, but couldn't. The shelter he had built, his greatest creation, his defiance, was drowning the same way he had once drowned under accusations. Outside, daylight shifted color, from gray to amber as the sun climbed. Through a roof hole, Alexei saw the first clear sky in months. Air, free and bright, spilled through the cracks and made him dizzy. "We can't stay," Lena said. "If the flood rises more, the upper floor will go next." He nodded slowly. "We go at dusk. Noise travels less." The hours before evening passed in near silence. Pavel dozed in his mother's lap, while Alexei mapped their escape on a page torn from a maintenance log. Their path would take them across debris, through the scrapyard, then east toward the old forest line. When dusk finally came, they packed what little remained: blankets, tools, a small coil of copper wire that Alexei refused to leave behind. "Weight of proof," he said, slinging it over his shoulder. "If anyone ever asks what kept us alive, I'll show them wires, not prayers." They climbed through the ventilation shaft, the one he had reinforced months earlier. It groaned but held. Halfway up, Lena whispered, "Will they think we're spirits if someone sees us?" "Spirits don't build exits," he muttered, shoving the hatch open. The outside air struck them like a slap, wet, fragrant, alive. The factory yard stretched beneath twilight, puddles shining like sheets of glass. A breeze carried the smell of thawing earth mixed with burnt oil. They paused there, standing among rust and reawakening world. Then, behind them, a distant crash thundered through the ground, a deep, mournful sound as the lower tunnels finally gave way. Dust surged up through cracks, rising like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pavel clung to his father's coat. "Papa, is it gone?" "Yes," Alexei said softly. The machine stopped breathing. They turned toward the horizon, where the faint outline of forest waited beyond the slag heaps. Each step away from the factory felt both betrayal and absolution, the end of an argument between man and stone. When they reached the outer fence, Alexei looked back once. A low mist had settled over the roof holes, glowing gold with the setting sun. It looked almost peaceful. Lena took his hand. "We survived." He nodded, eyes still on the sunlit ruin. "Now we must prove why." Together they stepped into the trees, the sound of moving water fading behind them like the last heartbeat of a buried world. The forest accepted them without ceremony. Damp needles muffled their footsteps, and mist clung to the trunks like slow-moving ghosts. For the first hours, adrenaline carried them forward. Then came silence, the kind that reminded them how utterly alone they were. Alexei led, compass steady in his hand, though the needle quivered from nearby ore deposits. Behind him, Lena and Pavel carried what remained of their life: a bundle of tools, a jar of flour, 2 tin cups. "Keep breathing slowly," Alexei said, eyes fixed on the dim horizon. "It conserves warmth." Pavel tried to obey, but each breath fogged the air like a small confession of fear. The deeper they went, the fainter the factory's silhouette became, until only the smell of rust lingered. Snowmelt trickled down slopes in clear threads. Birds, unseen all winter, sang hesitantly, as if testing whether the world still allowed music. By dusk, they reached a clearing. Broken telegraph poles lined one edge, leaning like tired sentinels. A fragment of the old field road wound north, rutted but navigable. Alexei crouched, studying prints in the mud: deer, hare, and something heavier, possibly a man wearing boots within the last day. "Someone passed here," he murmured. Lena's eyes widened. "Then there are people?" "Maybe," he said, But not all people help fugitives. They camped under a rock overhang. Alexei built a small fire in a depression and shielded it with sheet metal to hide the glow. Sparks popped softly. Smoke rose straight, meaning the air was calm. While Pavel slept, Lena watched her husband in the flicker. His face looked sharper than ever, weathered by both frost and calculation. "You were right," she said quietly. "Numbers kept us alive. But what now? There are no equations for what comes next." He poked the coals gently. "There's one. Hope over fear. If that quotient is above one, everything functions." She smiled despite herself. "You sound like you're lecturing students again." "I miss that chalkboard noise," he admitted. "It used to sound like thought taking shape." The next morning, rain began, cold but gentle. They followed the field road until it widened into a gravel track, the kind maintenance crews once used for mine logistics. On its margins, wild grass hid remnants of cables and rusted drums. Signs of habitation appeared by noon, a burnt watchtower, then a collapsed barn. Near the barn, they found something impossible, a child's swing frozen mid-arc, rope stiff with age, still tethered to a birch. Lena touched it briefly, eyes filling. "Someone lived here too." "They moved when the contracts ended," Alexei said. "This whole valley emptied after the shutdowns. The ministry pulled everyone east. Their third day brought exhaustion. Shoes soaked, fingers cracked. Pavel developed new blisters and said little. Alexei began rationing silence as carefully as food. They walked only during twilight hours to avoid drones, rumored to patrol industrial corridors even after abandonment. On the fourth day, they reached the old railway embankment. A single rusting track ran north, vanishing between pines. Moss covered the sleepers, but further ahead they could see shapes, freight cars tipped on their sides, a minor derailment from years ago. "Shelter," Alexei said. They hurried toward it. Inside one overturned car, the wood smelled of soot and mice, but it was dry. He cleared debris while Lena spread blankets. Pavel curled beneath them instantly, asleep before they even lit a lamp. Outside, wind carried the cry of a distant whistle, faint but unmistakable. Lena glanced up. "A train? Maintenance, maybe. They still collect salvage." She hesitated. "Could we stop it? Ask for help?" He shook his head. "Help implies acknowledgement. The moment we exist again, we belong again. To laws, to debts, to blame. You speak as if life itself were a verdict. In Norovsk, it is." Night deepened. The whistle faded into the hills. They listened to its echo like a lullaby from another world. In the morning, sounds of footsteps on gravel woke him. He stiffened, gripping his wrench. Outside, two figures approached, one carrying a shotgun, the other a coil of wire. Their coats bore the faded emblem of Infrastructure Division. Alexei whispered, "Hide him," and stood to meet them halfway. The older man raised a hand. "Easy, comrade." "We saw smoke." "Just passing through," Alexei said evenly. "No trouble meant." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're far from any settlement. Papers?" Alexei's silence was answer enough. The younger guard looked nervous. "He looks like someone. From the bulletins." "Bulletins are old," Alexei said. "So is the truth." The older one studied him for a long moment, then lowered the shotgun slightly. His voice softened. "You're the engineer, aren't you? From Norovsk mine. They said you vanished in the collapse." Alexei felt the frozen ground tilt under him. "Then you already know what they decided." The man's expression shifted from suspicion to weariness. Decided, yes. Believed, no. Half the town knew the supports were counterfeit. But saying so then? He shrugged. "None of us wanted to join the dead." He looked past Alexei toward Lena and the boy. "If anyone asks, I never saw you. Walk north 2 days. You'll reach the river depot. Barges still go east in spring." Alexei's throat tightened. "Why help us?" The man's gaze drifted to the sky. Because maybe someone should survive who built something that actually held. He turned away, motioning his partner to follow. Within minutes, their footsteps faded into forest hush. Lena stepped out slowly, disbelief written on her face. "He knew you." "Yes," Alexei said, "and he let me live with it." That night, they watched the stars through cracks in the freight car roof. Pavel reached for one, murmuring, "Look, Papa, lights that never go out." Alexei smiled tiredly, because they're too far to be taken by decree. Tomorrow, they would reach the river and choose which direction counted as freedom. Behind them lay a drowned factory. Ahead, a world that had erased their names. But somewhere between loss and discovery, they had become proof that even forgotten designs can hold through the thaw. Dawn found them at the river. They knew. It was broader than Alexei remembered from his surveying days, perhaps 30 meters across, fast with snowmelt, carrying fragments of ice that turned lazily before sinking downstream. The current whispered against stones, like a language older than pain. They stood on the bank for a long while. Across the water, dark forest stretched toward the east, the line of another district, another jurisdiction. If they crossed, they would truly vanish from everything connected to Norovsk. Pavel broke the silence. "How do we get over, Papa?" Alexei scanned the shore and spotted wreckage, sections of dock timbers half submerged, an overturned barge caught in reeds. "We build," he said simply. "One more time." Lena exhaled a weary laugh. "Of course we do." He sent Pavel to collect branches while he examined the barge. Its hull was split near the stern, but parts of the decking were still solid. Using the wrench and wire they had carried since the factory, he repaired 2 crossbeams and lashed them to floating panels. Ice water numbed his hands, but precision returned with reflex. The rhythm calmed him, measuring, tightening, testing load by subtle bends. Lena helped pack belongings into waterproof sacks made from tar cloth. The smell of pine resin filled the air as they sealed them. By afternoon, the raft floated, crooked but buoyant. Alexei anchored it with a length of cable until they were ready. Before launching, he took one last look west. Smoke from distant chimneys blurred into low clouds. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Norovsk still existed in its bureaucratic twilight. Slate buildings humming with lies that had outlived their victims. "Let them keep their records," he muttered. "Truth doesn't need archives." The crossing began at dusk. The water stung their feet as they pushed off, then pulled them into a current faster than expected. Pavel clutched the side, eyes wide. Lena steadied him as Alexei worked the paddle made from a broken plank. Halfway across, the cable rope snapped free, swirling away. The raft yawed violently. For an instant, Lena gasped as frigid spray drenched them. Pavel slipped to his knees. Alexei lunged to grab him, catching a sleeve just before the boy could tumble overboard. "Hold tight," he shouted over the roar of water. He adjusted his angle, fighting the spin. Years of machine calibration returned through muscle memory, timing, compensation, counter-pressure. Each stroke turned chaos back into motion. When the opposite bank loomed close enough to smell earth again, Lena wept without noticing. They landed hard against gravel. Alexei dragged the raft onto shore and collapsed beside it. For several minutes, none spoke. Only wind moved through birch leaves, whispering the same question over and over. Now where? When breath returned, Lena knelt beside him. "We're on the other side. Does that mean we're free?" He looked up at the skeletal clouds drifting overhead. Freedom's just distance without pursuit. But yes, it's a start. They followed the river east for 2 days, the land flattening into meadows, scattered with the remains of production farms, concrete towers overgrown by ivy, silos split open like discarded shells. Every ruin reminded Alexei of the system that devoured itself. On the 3rd morning, A small hamlet appeared beyond the fog. Smoke curled from chimneys. Wooden fences traced uneven lines around fields beginning to thaw. Lena hesitated. "We can't wander forever. Pavel needs rest, real food." Alexei agreed reluctantly. "If they ask, we're travelers from the North Line. Flood took our home." In the village, they met a group of field workers mending tools outside a shed. Their clothes were patched, their eyes cautious, but not cruel. When Lena offered a polite greeting, one woman gestured silently toward an empty barn. "Stay there tonight," she said. "No one will ask questions." Inside the barn's quiet warmth, life returned in details. The smell of hay, the faint hum of insects already waking for spring. Pavel fell asleep almost instantly. Later, the woman returned carrying soup in a tin pan. "We heard stories," she said, watching Alexei, "about Norovsk, about an engineer who warned the mine board and disappeared." He set the bowl down, tensing. "Stories grow fast in winter." "Maybe," she answered, "but sometimes the snow remembers truth better than the living." She placed the pan near the lamp and turned to leave. Before reaching the door, she added, "If the world forgot you, it's because it was afraid of names stronger than theirs." When she was gone, Lena whispered, "They know who you are." "Then let them remember kindly," he said. "That's all we ever needed." In the following days, Alexei helped mend farm tools, repairing broken plow parts and refitting a water pump. His skill, impossible to hide, spread quietly through the village. Soon people began to bring him broken stoves, cracked pipes, even radios. Payment came as bread, milk, and acceptance. No one asked questions, but every glance carried awareness. One evening, elders invited him to sit by their central fire. "Tell us how you survived the winter," one said. He hesitated, then spoke, not of accusations or flight, but of design. "Metal keeps warmth longer than cloth," he said. "Stone remembers heat even when men forget justice. We built a shelter that breathed because we refused to stop breathing ourselves." The listeners nodded solemnly. To them, it was not defiance but wisdom, how to endure quietly under oversight and frost alike. When the fire burned low, the oldest of them, a grey-bearded farmer, placed a calloused hand on Alexei's shoulder. "What the authorities destroy, time restores. You proved that. We won't forget your methods." That night, as wind rattled the barn doors, Alexei lay awake beside Lena and Pavel. Moonlight cut stripes across the floorboards. He realized with awe that the blueprint he'd drawn for survival was now passing by word of mouth, no longer needing paper or signature. Outside, frogs began calling from the flooded ditches, sign of another thaw, another beginning. He whispered to the darkness, "If they ever find the factory ruins, they'll think the walls built themselves. Let them." The world above had buried him once, but the earth below had kept him safe long enough to rise again, not as an engineer of stone and steel, but of memory. 2 years passed before anyone dared walk into the ruins of Norovsk. By then, the mining board had been dissolved, its officials reassigned or quietly retired. The valley sat silent under moss and rust, a monument to bureaucracy's short memory. The inspection team that arrived in early summer came not for justice, but for reclamation. The government wanted to scrap the remaining machinery, sell the steel, and close the inventory books once and for all. Their leader, a young surveyor, descended into the factory's hollow shell with a flashlight and a clipboard. What he found startled him more than the emptiness. Brick walls reinforced neatly with unfamiliar techniques, beams tensioned with wire in geometric patterns, ducts rerouted by intention, not decay. "This wasn't collapse prevention," he whispered to his partner. "It's design." Sunlight filtered through roof fractures, falling on walls that still bore faint charcoal markings, formulas for airflow, load ratios, temperature differentials. Beside them, a child's drawing, crooked figures holding hands inside a square labelled home. The inspector took photographs, then stepped into a smaller chamber where rusted pipes crisscrossed like ribs. There he found something stranger still, a plaque hammered to steel, letters etched carefully by hand, to those who breathe beneath silence. A. Morozov. He touched the metal lightly. Around him, the walls whispered with the faint draft of old ventilation shafts, the system still functioning in miniature, drawing cool air up from the drowned tunnels below. That afternoon, workers gathered outside to discuss findings. "It's as if someone rebuilt the place underground," one said. "Why would they bother when the factory was finished?" "Maybe to survive," answered another quietly. News spread up the bureaucratic ladder, summarized eventually in a bland report. Unidentified structural modifications, likely post-accident habitation. Evidence of human adaptation indicates exceptional engineering practice. The file ended there, archived under historical curiosities. But north of the valley, in the village by the river, another story persisted. Children sat near a mechanic's shed, listening as an older boy explained how Morozov's shelter worked, how air flowed like breath, how walls stored warmth as patiently as a heart stores faith. They didn't know the engineer's face, only that he had once taught every stone around them to wait out the storm. Inside the shed, Alexei himself worked quietly, sanding the handle of a water pump for the cooperative's new well. His hair had silvered, but his movements were steady. He no longer flinched at the clang of hammers or the echo of wind through ducts. Each sound was simply part of a rhythm he understood by heart. Lena entered carrying bread. "They tell your story now," she said. "Every new family asks about the shelter man." He smiled faintly. "Stories are better builders than I ever was. They don't rust. They call you a legend. Legends don't have bills to pay." He glanced at Pavel outside, showing smaller kids how to patch pipes with resin cloth. But they last. For a long moment, they stood in shared silence. The world beyond the village might never forgive or acknowledge them, but in this small pocket of land, life pulsed again, steady, self-reliant, deliberate. Each evening, as dusk bled into the forest, Alexei walked to the riverbank. The water ran clearer now, fish flashing under the surface. He would kneel, pick up a stone, and test its weight, the way he once tested integrity in equations. Then he'd toss it into the current and watch concentric waves travel outward, dissolving without trace. One night, Lena joined him, arm linked through his. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The factory? The idea of proving them wrong?" He thought for a while. "I already did. We're still alive." Wind swept through birch leaves, carrying scents of pine and smoke. Somewhere beyond the hills, trains still passed, their horns faint through distance, remnants of a world that had erased him, yet carried his logic in every bridge and tunnel it built. He pressed his fingers to the earth. "They took our home," he said softly. "So we taught the world how to build one anywhere." When they turned back toward the lights of the village, the river shimmered with the reflection of stars, distant, constant, untouchable. And far away, in the silent caverns of the old factory, air still moved through forgotten vents, whispering like breath through the lungs of memory.